Hello and welcome to episode 18 of Sibling Rivalry on my podcast, India and the World. I'm so glad you're here. Our last few episodes were focused around the 1971 war. We looked at the run up, conduct, and immediate aftermath of the war. Now let's move forward in time to look at the rest of that decade. It's a period where the spotlight shifted from security issues to internal political developments in both countries. And these developments were interesting in a strange, twisted way. It was like that movie where two characters find they have suddenly interchanged souls with each other. India, which had been a stable democracy since independence, slid into a dark period of dictatorship. And Pakistan, which had been a dictatorship through most of its lifespan, was celebrating a tentative, newly blossomed democratic rule under a civilian government. It's even more ironical that Pakistan's so called democratic government was led by Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. Bhutto was the quintessential political survivor. You may recall from previous episodes that he was the foreign minister under Ayub Khan's rule. He was one of the key interfaces with foreign governments and also among the decision makers behind Operation Gibraltar, which ultimately led to the 1965 war. But after the Tashkent agreement, he gauged that the public sentiment had turned against Ayub. In fact, he had actively provoked people through rumors of a secret agreement by Ayub on Tashkent. He distanced himself from the Ayub regime, resigned his position, and founded the Pakistan People's Party. During the Yahya Khan era, Bhutto had publicly aligned himself with the military clique once again. He was to a great extent personally responsible for the war and secession of Bangladesh. When the first ever elections by universal franchise threw up a result that were unfavorable to him, Bhutto created a crisis by refusing to allow the majority leader Mujibur Rahman to take over as the Prime Minister. When General Yahya Khan had tried to broker a political compromise between Mujibur Rahman and Bhutto, he had flatly refused to cooperate. The resentment in East Pakistan started a chain reaction of popular uprising, brutal military suppression, refugee crisis, and ultimately the Indian military intervention. But after the humiliating surrender in Dhaka, Bhutto quickly dissociated himself from the regime once again. He channelized the public anger towards the army and rode the wave of popular sentiment, seamlessly stepping into the president's office as the great democratic savior. Yet, even as a civilian democrat, he chose to govern Pakistan as the world's first civilian chief martial law administrator or CMLA. He sat in the executive chair wielding the exact same absolute dictatorial martial law powers that the generals had used to suppress the country for decades. Bhutto argued that he needed these powers to bypass a slow parliament and push through massive urgent reforms to reorganize the state. He used his sweeping powers as CMLA to nationalize major banks, insurance companies, and heavy industries, implementing aggressive state organized economic interventions. In his first public broadcast, he played the ultimate populist, promising to pick up the pieces and build a new proud Pakistan. People in Pakistan looked at him with intense conflicting emotions. To some, he was a savior, while to others, he was a dangerous demagogue. Biographer Stanley Wolpert writes, "Most Pakistanis I met either loved or hated Zulfi Bhutto. Perhaps others would say, in him there are Jesus and Judah both." But there was a darker side to this paradox. Though Bhutto loved posing as a democrat in principle, he behaved like an autocrat in practice. Opposition leaders watched in horror as Bhutto set up a brutal paramilitary force called the Federal Security Force to violently disrupt opposition rallies, lock up political rivals, and muzzle any journalist who dared to criticize him. But his absolute biggest achievement was that he managed to give Pakistan something it had never been able to secure in over 25 years of independence: a consensus based federal parliamentary constitution. Now, if you look at Pakistan's history of getting a constitution passed, it was always an absolute nightmare. The country was deeply polarized, torn between modernists who wanted a secular, progressive welfare state and traditionalists who wanted to preserve classical frameworks. And on the third side were the fundamentalists who demanded a strict orthodox Islamic structure. But Bhutto was a master negotiator. He managed to bridge these seemingly impossible divides. He appeased the modernists by structuring an assembly designed to make laws based on rational human deliberations. Simultaneously, he pacified the orthodox ulema by weaving in key Islamic clauses that guaranteed the protection of religious values. He cajoled, he flattered, he pressured, and he horse traded behind closed doors until he got virtually every single opposition group to sign on the dotted line. It was a massive triumph. For the first time, Pakistan had a democratic constitutional framework that everyone agreed on. Bhutto had successfully legitimized his rule. And while democracy was thus tentatively blossoming in Islamabad, a dark, suffocating cloud was quietly gathering over New Delhi. By 1975, Indira Gandhi was facing a massive crisis of her own. The glow of her triumphant victory in 1971 was fading. It was replaced by severe economic trouble, skyrocketing inflation, and immense domestic strain that the refugee crisis and the cost of war had placed on Indian economy. This forced India to desperately seek international debt rescheduling just to stay afloat. This economic misery fueled a wave of street protests and a countrywide agitation under the leadership of Jayaprakash Narayan, or JP. He actively urged students to quit their studies, demanded that elected legislators in Gujarat and Bihar resign their seats, and successfully mobilized massive public strikes, such as the crippling 1974 railway strike, to disrupt national economic activity. Already besieged by this political challenge, Indira Gandhi also suffered a legal blow. Her defeated opponent in the Raebareli constituency during the 1971 general elections, Rajnarayan, had filed a case against her, alleging improper use of official resources for her election campaign. Specifically, she was accused of utilizing the servants of a government official, that is, her close aide Yashpal Kapoor, as her election agent even before he had formally resigned from state service. Additionally, the petition challenged her use of government machinery, including local police, civil servants, and state owned transport and helicopters, to construct campaign rostrums and manage logistics for her election rallies. Mrs. Gandhi had taken this threat lightly because her law minister H.R. Gokhale had assured her that there was no legal basis for concern. But on the morning of June 12, 1975, when the Allahabad High Court delivered the historic verdict, her confidence proved unfounded. Her close aide Mohammed Younis recalls in his book People's Passions and Politics, and I quote, "I got a phone call from Rajiv Gandhi around 10 a.m. He said, 'The judgment has come. Mummy has been unseated.'" End quote. The court had found the Prime Minister guilty of electoral corruption and malpractice. This meant her election to Parliament was set aside. Under the strict mandates of the law, the conviction carried an automatic disqualification that barred Mrs. Gandhi from holding any elected public office for over a period of 6 years. The ruling posed a threat to her political survival. Suddenly, the Iron Lady was cornered, with opponents marching in the streets demanding her immediate resignation. Faced with the threat of losing her office, Indira Gandhi did not back down. She did not seek a compromise. Instead, on the night of 25th June 1975, she declared a state of national emergency in a broadcast to the nation.
भाइयों और बहनों, राष्ट्रपति जी ने आपातकाल की घोषणा की है। इससे आतंकित होने का कोई कारण नहीं है। आप सभी गहरे और व्यापक षड्यंत्र से अवगत होंगे जो उस समय से रचा जा रहा है जब से मैंने भारत के जनसाधारण के लाभ के लिए कुछ प्रगतिशील उपाय करने शुरू किए। प्रजातंत्र के नाम पर प्रजातंत्र के काम को ही नकारने की कोशिश की जा रही है। विधिवत रूप से निर्वाचित सरकारों को कार्य नहीं करने दिया गया है और कुछ मामलों में वैध रूप से निर्वाचित विधानसभाओं को विघटित करने के उद्देश्य से सदस्यों को इस्तीफा देने के लिए बाध्य किया गया। आंदोलनों से वातावरण भर गया, जिनसे हिंसात्मक वारदातें हुई। कुछ लोग तो हमारे सशस्त्र सैनिकों तथा पुलिस को विद्रोह करने के लिए उकसाने लगे हैं। कुछ के कार्यों से अधिकांश लोगों के अधिकार खतरे में पड़ रहे हैं। कोई भी ऐसी स्थिति जिससे देश के भीतर निर्णायक रूप से कार्य करने की राष्ट्रीय सरकार की क्षमता कमजोर होती है, वह बाहरी खतरे को निश्चय ही प्रोत्साहन देगी। मैं आपको यह विश्वास दिलाना चाहती हूँ कि इस नए आपातकाल की घोषणा से कानून प्रिय नागरिकों के अधिकारों पर किसी प्रकार से असर नहीं पड़ेगा। मुझे विश्वास है कि आंतरिक स्थिति में तेजी से सुधार होगा, जिससे हम जल्द से जल्द इस घोषणा को समाप्त कर सकेंगे। भारत के सभी हिस्सों तथा जनता के सभी वर्गों की सद्भावना संदेशों के लिए मैं अत्यंत आभारी हूँ। मैं आपसे आने वाले दिनों में आपके सतत सहयोग और विश्वास की अपील करती हूँ।
India ceased to function as a democracy, as the democratic institutions were left in suspended animation. Along with the institutions, the first people to be discarded were the sensible advisors who had been behind Indira's greatest triumphs. Trusted advisors like P.N. Asghar were completely sidelined, replaced by the coterie of hangers-on around Sanjay Gandhi. The Prime Minister's younger son functioned as an unconstitutional authority with sweeping powers over the government, its ministers, and its entire machinery. By late 1975, the subcontinent looked completely topsy-turvy. In India, the press was effectively muzzled by a stringent censorship. Fundamental rights were suspended, and lakhs of political dissidents were locked up in jails without trial. Meanwhile, in Islamabad, Bhutto was having a quiet laugh, making the most of this unusual turn of events. The timing was ironic. India's descent into autocracy coincided with the tentative rise of democracy in Pakistan. It was not that Bhutto was much of a democrat. Even though the constitution had been promulgated in 1973, he had not opted to hold fresh elections under its provisions. He derived his legitimacy from his performance in the ill-fated 1971 elections, where his party had received the highest number of seats in West Pakistan. And the fate of his opponents was no better than that of Indira Gandhi's during emergency. But ever the opportunist, Bhutto travelled the world, boasting to the Western leaders that Pakistan was now the progressive, stable and true democratic light of South Asia. It was a brilliant pitch, and it secured him massive diplomatic goodwill and economic aid. But all the international attention he received fed into Bhutto's worst weakness, his supreme cocky overconfidence. And thus began Bhutto's own downfall and Pakistan's slide back into familiar territory of military rule. In a calculated bid to bolster his democratic image and secure another term, Bhutto announced early general elections on 7th January 1977. This caught a fragmented opposition completely off guard. At the time, Bhutto appeared powerfully entrenched, with his opposition either jailed or fragmented. He was convinced the public would reward him for his populist reforms and his consensus constitution. But his high spirits and confidence suffered an immediate shock when nine different opposition parties, ranging from secular regional groups to orthodox regional parties, came together and united under the banner of the Pakistan National Alliance or PNA. This alliance had the backing of leading clerics like Maulana Mufti Mahmud and some military veterans like Air Marshal Asghar Khan. The announcement of elections in Pakistan put immense pressure on Indira Gandhi. She hated being seen as an autocrat on the global stage, while her bitter rival, Bhutto, was flaunting his democratic credentials. So, just 11 days after Bhutto's announcement, on 18th January, Mrs. Gandhi stunned India by relaxing the emergency and giving her own call for elections. She desperately wanted to reclaim the democratic legitimacy that Bhutto was currently basking in. Both leaders gambled their fates on the ballot box, completely convinced that they would win. But neither of them was prepared for how the people of the subcontinent would respond. The Indian elections of March 1977 turned out to be a peaceful revolution. The electorate, angry over 21 months of silenced newspapers and jailed leaders, turned out in massive numbers and delivered a crushing defeat to Indira Gandhi and her party. For the first time in 30 years of independence, Congress lost the elections. But to the credit of Indian democracy, Mrs. Gandhi accepted the verdict. She gracefully stepped down and handed over power to the victorious Janata Party. This peaceful transfer of power instantly restored India's global democratic prestige. It proved that the democratic roots in India, built around a representative assembly where decisions were made based on rational human deliberations, were far too deep for any one autocrat to rip out. In intellectual circles, there was a quiet, profound sense of relief that the constitutional checks and balances had been restored. But while India was celebrating a peaceful, democratic transition of power, Pakistan's elections turned into an absolute nightmare. When voting took place on 7th March 1977, the official results announced a staggering, mathematically implausible landslide for the ruling PPP. It claimed 155 out of the 200 National Assembly seats, leaving the opposition PNA with just 36 seats. The margin of victory stretched the limits of credulity, particularly in Punjab, where the PPP swept 107 out of the 115 seats. On election night, as the highly inflated numbers came in, even Bhutto reportedly became quiet, demanding to know what his overzealous local administrators were doing. Rejecting the fraudulent farce, the opposition PNA immediately boycotted the provincial assembly elections scheduled for 10th March. They took to the streets in a massive wave of protest, bringing the nation's major cities to a standstill. Despite brutal crackdowns by the police and the paramilitary Federal Security Force, the demonstrations, which included thousands of women and children facing live ammunition, grew increasingly uncontrollable. Trapped in a political deadlock of his own making, Bhutto was ultimately overthrown on the night of 4th July 1977 by his hand-picked Chief of Army Staff, General Ziaul Haq. Soldiers quietly cut the telephone lines, surrounded the Prime Minister's residence, and arrested Bhutto along with his top cabinet ministers in a bloodless coup named Operation Fair Play. Zia appeared on television wearing his military uniform, insisting that the army had no political ambitions and promising to hold free and fair elections within 90 days. But Zia's temporary regime would turn into 11 long years of absolute military dictatorship. It was a classic Greek tragedy of enormous proportions with all its twists and turns. Indira Gandhi, who had ruled India with an iron autocratic fist during the emergency, accepted her electoral defeat and walked away with grace. But in Pakistan, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, the man who had built Pakistan's first consensus based democratic constitution, clung so desperately to power that he invited the military back into taking control of the state. The great reversal had come full circle, and we were back to status quo ante. India returned to its democratic roots stronger and more resilient than before, and Pakistan slipped right back into the dark, cold embrace of martial law. But perhaps the most chilling act of this high stakes drama was Zia's betrayal of his own mentor Bhutto. Ziaul Haq was not the typical Pakistani military strongman. In fact, Bhutto had personally handpicked him from obscurity to lead the army, promoting him over the heads of several senior generals. Because Zia had no apparent political ambitions or popular base, Bhutto expected him to remain unconditionally loyal out of sheer gratitude. Instead, Bhutto's fateful miscalculation placed him at the absolute mercy of a subordinate whose quiet deference masked an underlying vengefulness. The complex, deeply personal, and ultimately fatal relationship between these two men, the aristocratic prime minister and the supposedly pliant general who would ultimately send him to the gallows, deserves a detailed telling. So, we are going to devote our entire next episode to this story. But that's all we have in today's episode. Join us for episode 19, where we will take a deep dive into the intertwined destinies of Bhutto and Zia and explore how Zia's subsequent 11-year dictatorship fundamentally reshaped Pakistan and the region. That's all we have for today. Thank you for listening to Sibling Rivalry. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing and please do share a link with friends who may be interested. See you next time.